Hi, everyone. So at this point in the week, we are shifting from our first text, which was Ronson, to our second text, which is Larson. And so this is all in preparation for our second essay, which is going to put the two into conversation. And so we're going to focus today on close reading, some close reading strategies, and practicing those strategies on a quotation or two from Larson. And so the activity is designed then to help prepare you for the quiz on Friday, and also for beginning to make connections between Larson and Ronson. So I think Larson is definitely one of the more challenging texts that we'll do this semester. And because of that, I think it's really good practice for the text you're going to be reading in XPOS, because by and large, they're going to be the difficulty level of Larson, but longer, right? So luckily with Larson, as we're practicing these skills, we get just 3 pages, right? So that's definitely, much more, I guess, doable, right, at the beginning of the semester for us. Okay, so before we get started, just to touch base with our calendar, our checklist for week 6. So let's pull that up. Okay, so here we are in week 6. Open up our checklist. And so we had the reading quiz on Ronson, right, on Monday. And Wednesday, then what we're working on, we completed the annotation exercise by this morning, 10 a.m. on Larson. And that's getting us ready then for the group work that we're doing now. That's due by the end of the day. And so, as I'm sure you've seen, each group has a passage, kind of 1 to 3 paragraphs that you're focusing in on, and you have a series of 7 to 8 questions to really kind of unpack that passage, to figure out what Larson's argument is, right? So his primary key term is relatability. So what is he saying about relatability, right? What is his attitude toward relatability? How does he define it? And so we're doing now our close reading videos. So this will actually help you both with the group work and then with the quiz on Friday. So we have that reading quiz. We're on number 5, and that's going to cover Larson. And so Friday, that will be due by the end of the day. And so for our close reading video activity, I recommend trying to complete that by the end of the day Thursday. If that's not possible, then just make sure you do that before you take the quiz on Larson, because again, I think that this will be helpful, our discussion today, on really kind of getting to the heart of what Larson is telling us about relatability. Okay, and then write our final draft of essay 1 if you wanted to take the extension. That's due by the end of the day Thursday. And after we take our quiz, I will be posting the prompt for essay 2. And so what we'll do then on Monday is we'll be focusing on going over quiz 4 and 5, making connections between Ronson and Larson, talking about the prompt, right? Kind of taking a look at some of the thought-provoker questions that will be on the prompt. And that will get us ready for Wednesday, when we'll do a peer review of our rough draft for paper 2. And we're off and rolling then toward the final draft. Okay, so let me pull up our slides for today's activity. And by the way, for future reference, if you want to look back through these slides, under our week 6 module, under handouts and resources, I've placed those slides there for you. Okay, let's get started. So again, we are practicing some close reading strategies, and we're applying those strategies to Larson's text and his title, right? Why do we obsess over what's relatable? And that certainly is his primary key term, right? What's relatable, and he transforms that key term into relatability, right? And so we of course want to think about, what does that mean? And again, what's his argument about relatability? Okay, and so when we're close reading, what we want to do is just start with an important passage, right? So as we're annotating, as we're doing our hypothesis assignment, of these passages, of these paragraphs, which ones seem the most important? And then once you do that and get a sense for an important passage, then you want to think about, which particular part of that passage seems most important. And then you start there, right? Really dig into that 1 to 2 sentences that seems the most important in that important passage. And that'll be the kind of key to unlock the overall meaning of the passage. So what we'll do for today is we'll take the last paragraph of the article. So with our group work that we're doing on Larson, we've divided up, the most important passages, except for this last paragraph. So this will kind of complete our coverage then of Larson's article. And so this last paragraph reads, "Our egos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. Instead of seeing relatable as something that connects us, we may one day imagine it as a double negative. Relatability measures how strange something isn't, the lack of mystery itself. But the last decade of the internet, in every venue from art to politics to media, has borne out Peretti's philosophy. So not only the social value of something, but also its economic viability depends on how shareable it is. And if what we share is a reflection of our identity, then the greatest value comes from sharing something that could validate our existence to as many people as possible, to constellate ourselves across the sky so that others may gaze up at the stars and whisper, 'It's me.'" All right. And so, as I mentioned, so we've decided that's a really important passage. And right, I mean, the last paragraph of an article is always going to be really important, right? That kind of the last bit of time you have with your reader, you really want to make a lasting impact. And so that's always a good place to look for something that you want to close read. And so we're going to choose then, 1 to 2 sentences from that quotation, right? So homing in on what seems like an especially important section of the passage, we're going to, choose a chunk of the passage that is no longer than 1 to 2 sentences. And this is for good reason, right? So this is all in preparation for drafting essay 2 and forming connections in body paragraphs to Ronson. And so we want to practice, first deciding, okay, this is an important passage. And then of this full paragraph, let's say, what's the most important 1 to 2 sentences? And we start there. So for our purposes, we're going to begin with the first sentence of the paragraph. So our egos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. Okay, and so let's pause for a moment. And first, what we're going to do is try paraphrasing the quotation to see how much we're able to pull from it on a first reading, right? So of course, we've already read the article, right? We've gone through, we've done our hypothesis activity. But just from re-encountering the quotation for the first time for this video, what can we pull out of it, right? What do we understand from it? Before we get into detail with our close reading process. Okay, and so this will help us track our progress over the course of this video. So our egos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. Okay, so take a few minutes and do your best at paraphrasing that sentence, that quotation, translating it into your own words, making sure that you don't stick too closely to the original language here, right? Because if you do that, then you're plagiarizing. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, so yeah, let's shift to close reading. So we're going to come back to our paraphrases later in the video, but for now, let's take a closer look at the particular language that Larson uses in the quotation, right? So when we're close reading, we're really kind of digging in and getting really close to the ground with our magnifying glass and looking at this quotation, right, to see what we can uncover. So our egos rather, fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. So here I recommend, as part of any good close reading strategy, to look some words up in the dictionary. So even if you have a general sense of what the words mean, this can be a really great brainstorming process, right? So particular words in a definition may kind of, spark some bulbs. You may make connections. So it's just a great place to get started. Okay, so again, they can be extremely useful for helping us to unpack a quotation so that we can read it closely and therefore come to understand it more fully. And so really, I mean, one way to think about quotations is they're like a piece of luggage, right? They're this bag with all this stuff inside of it, right? And right now it's closed. So you get a sense that it's heavy, that it's weighty, there's a lot in it. But when we unpack it, right? When we take words and phrases out of it and think about what they mean, that's when we're really close reading, right? And if you think about our ICY method from our body paragraph template, it walks us through that process. So after we paraphrase, then we go back, we reach into that quotation, right? And we pull out words or phrases and requote them to think through what they mean and how they might connect to the other text. So again, even if we have a general sense of what a given word might mean, when we come across what feels like a really important sentence in a text, one that we would like to close read using our ICY method, try picking a few words and looking them up. So let's pause again for a moment. Let's see what looking up a few words from Larson's quotation, the one that we've pulled out here from the larger passage, will help us to discover. So choose 3 words from the quotation that you would look up if you were asked to close read it. And there's the quotation. So take a couple minutes. Okay, and so which 3 did you choose? I'm excited to see. And so for our purposes, I went ahead and just pulled out 4, just hoping to cover at least a couple of the ones that you listed. Okay, so if we start with egos, right? So, we may have a general sense of what an ego is, but looking it up, it's going to be helpful, I promise. So what is an ego? So a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance, right? So we know what an ego is, but looking it up, it gives us some other language to play around with, right? When we go to interpret that quotation. So we set up a quotation, we paraphrase it, next move, right? Close read. So I can bring some of these words, right? This idea of self-esteem or this idea of self-importance into my sentence to really start close reading. Okay, and our next, let's go ahead and take fuel. So we have a general sense of what to fuel something means, but let's get a strong handle on it. So to fuel something, right, means to power something, to make it work. And now ecosystem. So I think this is one of the most important words to latch onto in this particular quotation to really uncover the point that Larson is making here. So an ecosystem, so from Oxford Dictionary, a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment, right? So in other words, here Larson is bringing in this kind of term from biology, right? Which should strike us as unusual, and that would make this sentence that we're close reading kind of a prime option for close reading, right? So if a writer uses a kind of surprising word or phrase, then that is usually a great choice for close reading, right? Because they're doing that for a reason. There was probably a word that would have been easier to use, right? That would have been more in keeping with the context of what they're writing about, the topic. But if they go for something kind of unusual or outside of their topic like this, then we want to think about why they're making that choice. And whenever you're asking why a writer makes particular choices, you're close reading and interpreting. Okay, so ecosystem, right? So we went into biology. So we're going to keep coming back to that idea of an ecosystem. Okay, and then also acrid. So what does acrid mean? So having an irritatingly strong and unpleasant taste or smell, right? So something tastes bad, it smells, right? So that's acrid. Okay, so before we pull this all together, let's think for a moment about ecosystems. So an example, let me close out all my notices here. So as an example of an ecosystem, let's consider a pond, let's say. So a pond facilitates a complex system of interconnected life forms, right? And that's, in other words, that's another definition of ecosystems, right? It's this system of interconnected life forms that depend on each other, right, in order to survive and to be healthy. And so, right, in a pond, you've got fish, you've got algae, turtle, ducks, frogs, etc. Okay, so in order for ecosystems to remain healthy, there needs to be some diversity in the life forms that are being interconnected. And that's important for maintaining a balance, right? And so biologists, I believe, call this biodiversity. So for the purposes of our example, if there is too much algae in a pond, then the fish will suffocate. If there are too many ducks, there will no longer be enough fish for these ducks to eat, right? So everything has to be balanced out. So in other words, if there is too much of any one life form, the balance will be off. And if the balance is off, right, if there's too much algae or too many fish, then the pond will begin, and you've guessed it, it's going to stink, right? It's going to become acrid. Okay, so let's hold on to this notion for a moment, that when Larson uses the word ecosystem, we know that ecosystems require biodiversity to remain healthy and in balance, right? In order for those ecosystems not to become acrid, not to start stinking, right? So there needs to be some sense of difference and diversity. Okay, so let's think of how Larson's key term relatability fits into the sentence we're unpacking here, right? So it's an important sentence. So let's think of how it relates to his overall key term. Okay, so again, our ecos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. So let's look at a moment in the article where Larson defines relatability directly. Okay, and we can find one of these moments on page 2, so a little earlier in the article. Relatability is a desire for a connection to the world, to want to see or to want what we see in others, especially if what we see in others is ourselves. Okay, so another really kind of packed, condensed sentence there. So let's think about these two questions in relation to one another. Okay, so when we read the second quotation, so Larson's definition of relatability, let's keep in mind the idea from the first quotation of an ecosystem and of how an ecosystem requires biodiversity to remain healthy and in balance. So in other words, we're thinking of the relationship between Larson's notion of an ecosystem with his notion of relatability, kind of what relatability has come to mean. In the hands of corporations, right, like BuzzFeed, Google, Twitter. So if relatability, as Larson defines it, is a desire for connection to the world, a desire, we could say, to form, and here's where the ecosystem comes in, right? A desire to form an interconnected ecosystem with others, right, to connect with others. We have to be careful if this desire is driven by wanting what we see in others, especially if what we see in others is ourselves, right? To bring some of that language back from his definition of relatability. So in other words, if the desire to connect with others is driven by our egos, right? That first part of the sentence of the paragraph we're looking at, our own self-interest and sense of self-importance. And notice here, right? Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So notice here, I've used some of the language from the dictionary definition to help with my close reading. And to unpack that meaning. And so, by the way, kind of doing that actually is not plagiarism if you look up the word and in multiple dictionaries, the same language is used to define it, right? Then that just means that's common knowledge. These are common words associated, and so you can use those. Okay, so again, if the desire is driven by our egos, in other words, our own self-interest and sense of self-importance, a sense of jealousy or a competition for what others have, then we are forming relationships with others not to value that person for who they are and for how he or she is different from us, but for how that person is similar or familiar, if we take the term from the quotation, to us. It is this similarity or familiarity that allows us to value others or be able to relate to them if what we see in others is ourselves. Okay, so we're getting closer, still some more unpacking to do to make sure we fully understand here. Okay, so with that in mind, right, we need to think back to our lesson about ecosystems, right? So, however, as we learn from our pond lesson, too much of the same thing, of the familiar, of the relatable, will throw our ecosystem, right? Our kind of community through which we're interconnected by social media, right? Google, BuzzFeed, etc. So too much of the same thing will throw our ecosystem out of balance, and it will become acrid with familiarity, to pull Larson's language back in. So in other words, our quote unquote pond, right, our kind of social media world, our online world of interconnectedness, it's about to start stinking, right? There's too much sameness, we're out of balance, we're becoming acrid for sure. So that is, if it is our own sense of self-importance and self-interest, our ego, so again, using that language from the dictionary definition in our close reading sentences. Okay, so if it is our own sense of self-importance and self-interest, our ego, in other words, that draws us to other people, rather than a sense of curiosity or the mystery of the unfamiliar, of wanting to connect with a person, not because they are similar to us, but because they are different, then our ecosystem is going to go bad. Okay, this then is what Larson means when he writes, our egos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. So if our egos drive our desire to connect with others, to relate, quote unquote, to them, then pretty soon our world will be filled with sameness. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. So on the upside, everyone will become relatable. Right? If everyone's the same, then no one's going to have a problem relating to someone else, right? Or nobody's going to have to be worried that nobody else can relate to them. However, to become relatable, everyone will have to become essentially the same, right? So you're going to end up with this ecosystem, this interconnected online world and community of pretty much the same person, right? We're all the same, that there's no difference to kind of make it a healthy and diverse ecosystem. Okay, and so all of that meaning, all of that warning is packed within that single sentence that we just close read. Okay, so let's pause for a moment. Let's try another round of paraphrasing. So now that we've spent a good deal of time unpacking the quotation, looking up some of its words in a dictionary, right, and pulling some of that dictionary definition into our close reading sentences, let's see if we can make our paraphrase more specific and accurate so that it can more fully capture Larson's meaning. So in other words, we've explored this, we've gone to the dictionary, we've done a bunch of brainstorming, we've been thinking it through. What's an ecosystem? How does it become acrid, right? And so with all of that in mind, let's try to write a better paraphrase, a more effective paraphrase of this quotation. Okay, so in 1 to 2 sentences, paraphrase the first sentence of Larson's final paragraph. Again, our ecos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. So let's think. How does your second paraphrase compare to your first? So what's the same? What's different? What do you understand now after our discussion that you didn't understand when you first read the sentence at the beginning of the video? We'll come back to that. I'll give you a couple minutes to respond. Okay, so with this fuller understanding of Larson's quotation in mind, with our more successful paraphrase, let's return to the last paragraph in Larson's article and examine the final sentence. So we were focusing on the first sentence of that final paragraph. Now we're going to shift to the last sentence. So that last sentence reads, and if what we share, right, in terms of sharing online content, right, memes, articles, etc. So if what we share is a reflection of our identity, of who we are, then the greatest value comes from sharing something that could validate our existence to as many people as possible, to constellate ourselves across the skies so that others may gaze up at the stars and whisper, "It's me." Okay, so this is another really loaded sentence, right? So we're going to want to spend a little time unpacking it. Okay, so we'll pause again for a moment. So first, let's just get a general impression. So just based on our conversation about the first sentence of this paragraph, in this final sentence, is Larson viewing relatability in a positive or a negative light? Okay, so read back over this quotation. Is he viewing relatability here in this final sentence in a positive or a negative light? Okay, and so again, yeah, let's think about this final sentence in relation to the sentence that began the paragraph. So again, our egos fuel an ecosystem that can become acrid with familiarity. Okay, and again, and if what we share is a reflection of our identity, then the greatest value comes from sharing something that could validate our existence to as many people as possible, to constellate ourselves across the skies so that others may gaze up at the stars and whisper, "It's me." Okay, and so, always just kind of going in and identifying what we think are the most important words or phrases and keeping those in mind as we're making connections or close reading. Okay, so keeping in mind Larson's lesson from the first sentence of the paragraph about ecosystems and how they need diversity or difference in order not to become acrid with familiarity, this final image, right, of the stars spread out across the sky and people on the ground gazing up at them. So as beautiful as it sounds, it's actually a warning. So in other words, Larson is viewing relatability here in a negative light. So when we share relatable, quote unquote, relatable online content with others, we are motivated, Larson, right, is suggesting, we're motivated primarily by a desire for others to know that we exist, right, to validate our existence, rather than by a desire to connect with that person. And so as a result, we end up disconnected. So we want everyone to see us constellate ourselves across the sky, right? We want them standing down on the ground watching us. We want that attention. But instead of seeing us when they look up in the sky, because they too are driven by relatability, by the desire to see in others ourselves. In other words, to see ourselves in other people rather than to see those people for themselves. So those standing on the ground see only themselves, right? They look up at the stars and they go, oh, it's me. So in other words, right, we want people to look up at the stars and think, wow, look at her, look at him. But what they do instead is look at the stars and say, wow, look at me, right? And so you end up with this ecosystem, right, that's full of sameness and it's just acrid, right? It's unhealthy. Everybody is just focused on their egos. Okay, so relatability, which may have begun with the desire to connect with the world, right? If we think back to his quotation that defines relatability, right, by desire to connect with the world or with others, what happens because of relatability and the particular meaning it's taken on and how it's used by online corporations and by ourselves, that relatability driven by a connection or a desire to want to connect with other people actually ends up leaving us disconnected instead. Okay, and to top off our close reading here, this warning, right, that this desire to connect is going to leave us disconnected. So that warning is emphasized, and notice our close reading verb there, right? So thinking of those close reading verbs, suggest, implies, emphasize, indicates. So this warning is emphasized by the structure of Larson's paragraph, which begins, as we saw, right, when we focused on this first sentence, which begins with our egos. So it begins with this concept of ego, right, of being self-interested, right? So it begins with our egos and it ends with the phrase, it's me, right? So the sense then is that relatability and the way it's been defined and the way it's been exploited by advertisers, publishers, social media companies, and basically what that relatability produces is an egocentric world, right? When we're looking to others because we want to see ourselves, not because we want to see them. And so what the world lacks then is difference, diversity. It lacks challenge, right? If everybody's exactly like us, are views ever going to be challenged? No. Are we ever going to have to think something through? No. And so that, right, is Larson's warning then about relatability. Okay, so again, I hope you find this helpful as you are studying for the quiz on Friday and as you're completing the group work for the end of the day. And as always, if you have questions, email me, come by office hours. So I have office hours on Thursday, 1 to 2. Okay, otherwise, I will let you have at it. Okay, bye.